Here's an extensive detail of the abuse of black male slaves by white women. According to a certain historian, few scholars have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, in part because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional unfeminist notion of women as too weak, emotionally and physically, to commit serious crimes, let alone sexual abuse, and the idea that men cannot be raped. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that women, too, are capable of committing horrid sexual offenses and using sex as a means of domination and control. You are welcome to this video. Don't forget to hit the like button right in front of you, share with friends to spread our black narrative, and then subscribe to stay with the family. As light-skinned enslaved women who were the product of mixed-race couplings were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation, so were light-skinned male slaves finding themselves a great deal the particular target of such sexual exploitation. Apparently, they may have attracted their enslavers more, who in most cases were swooned by the mere sight of them and would exert racial supremacist authority over exercising them as their sex property. As Thomas Buckley found in his analysis of divorce in antebellum Virginia, roughly 9% of Virginia's divorce petitions from 1786 to 1851 were for interracial adultery, with 23 of those petitions coming from white men who complained about their wives' relationships with black men. Peter Nielsen, traveling in Virginia in the 1820s, recorded that he had learned about a planter's daughter having fallen in love with one of her father's slaves. She had actually seduced him. In her 1861 autobiography, Harriet Jacobs told the chilling story of a male slave named Luke, who was kept chained at his bedridden master's bedside so that he would be constantly available to tend to his physical needs, which included sexual favors. In veiled language so as not to offend the sensibilities of 19th century polite society, Jacobs reported that most days Luke was only allowed to wear a shirt so that he could be easily flogged if he committed an infraction, such as resisting his master's sexual advances. In a 2011 Journal of the History of Sexuality article, the scholar Thomas Foster contended that enslaved black men regularly were sexually exploited by both white men and white women, which took a variety of forms, including outright physical penetrative assault, forced reproduction, sexual coercion and manipulation, and psychic abuse. In one example provided by Foster, a man named Lewis Bourne filed for divorce in 1824 due to his wife's longtime sexual liaison and continued pursuit of a male slave named Edmund from their community. Foster contended that such pursuits could enable white women to enact radical fantasies of domination over white men, while at the same time subjecting the black enslaved male to her control. Foster also contended that such pursuits were not uncommon, as demonstrated by testimonies from the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, established by the Secretary of War in 1863, which took depositions from abolitionists and slaves regarding the realities of slave life. Such depositions included stories of sexual liaisons between enslaved men and their mistresses. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women forcing black men into having sex. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, stated, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence is I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. Foster further concurs with scholars who argue that can serve as a metaphor for both enslaved women and men, as the vulnerability of all enslaved black persons to nearly every conceivable violation produced a collective subjectivity.
Welcome back to Breakdown Friday. I am Joseph Ward. As you know, I got my homies with me, Patrick Irvin, Professor Carl Tone Jones, and we are here talking about a subject that we've mentioned in the past, but we deep diving in it today. We're giving it a full breakdown. The sexual abuse of black men, but we're giving it from a historical context. But we're going to talk about it as a whole, but we want to talk about the historical context of the sexual abuse of black men in America, starting with slavery, because, you know, black men have been branded as the the perpetrator of SA against white women. And you know, the propaganda that was created in the early you know, it was going through the early 1900s, but it began before then. But I'm thinking about the movie Birth of a Nation, when it was really brought to life via the big screen through that movie. But you know, the trope of the black male being the over sexualized brute who ravages women. But it turns out that black men were and still are often victims of SA. Hence the movie or the documentary that Tariq Nasheed put out, the butt breaking documentary. So that is one of the things that we're getting into, but we're talking about just the straight up sexual abuse of black men from white women, from white men, and we're also talking about slave breeding as well. So we want to get into it and break down all of this, because when it comes to SA against black men specifically, of course it don't happen. We want to sweep it under the rug. It's not talked about on a wide scale. Black men are not given spaces to talk about that. Men, period, are not given spaces, but especially black men. But you know, we can do what we want to do on this channel, so that's what we're doing. But before we get into the discussion, make sure you hit that like button. Hit that like button with both your fingers. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Make sure you can get as many people as possible involved in this conversation. And remember, if you don't like this video, if you don't hit that like button, and you are not African American, Joe Biden told me to tell you, you better hit that button or you ain't black no more. So let's get into it. PC, man, you already know I'm coming to you first, man. You the historian, man. Y'all, hey, man, look. PC be bringing that history, and y'all know he do. So, Pat, you got your bowl, because he finna cook. If you don't get your bowl, you ain't gonna have no more food left, because I'm gonna eat it all. So, get the bowl.
Oh, we're about to experience some wild turkey tonight.
Hey, man, wow. It's a wild turkey soup. But no, let's get into it, man. Let's you seen the video. It was given a history of how black men were specifically the victims of sexual assault by white women. I want to have that conversation, but I want to have an overall conversation about the sexual abuse of black men. So what are your thoughts on the video, but also what are your thoughts on the overall abuse of black men?
Well, like everything else, man, you know, black men have become the scapegoats for all things necessary to move a social agenda forward. And so when we examine these particular cases, and it goes back to the this goes back to early 1600 lore. Actually, prior to this became the legitimizing and the justification for the institution of slavery, is that black people, specifically black men, who were 90% of the first captives of slavery in America, Africans in America, were identified as being savages, and with an incredible sexual hunger and lust for white women, or they were a danger to white women. So, and this is largely, you know, and you can read a lot about this in Dr. Tommy Curry's book.
Yeah.
You know, when he talks about, I forget the damn title.
The Man Not.
The Man Not, right. You can read about this in The Man Not, when Dr. Tommy Curry speaks to the obsession with black men's genitals by white men. And
Well, talk about that too.
They've always fantasized about figuring out a way to try to conquer it. And they've always felt inept in dealing with the concept of black genitals. And so specifically because they've always seen and observed their women lusting after that body part on black men, specifically seeing as many of the African enslaved peoples, our ancestors, were naked most of the time. So with body parts exposed. Now we can go into how they've developed a lot of narratives to cloud the history, because even in Wilmington, North Carolina, right? In 1898, there was a big there's one of the first race riots or race massacres in the country's history. And and I'm talking about in freed towns since the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And what you found is these white supremacist groups were printing narratives about needing to protect their children, their women, from these black savages. And then because the majority of the white population couldn't read, they would put it in comics. So this is where you get the concept of political comics. It wasn't just used for this purpose, but it was used to pass on a message that was so clear that even somebody who was illiterate could understand it. And the propaganda campaign had begun years prior to, because at this particular time in Wilmington's in North Carolina, right? In North Carolina, they had passed laws that made it legal for black men to hold positions in government. And so you had black men sitting on the state legislature. And it was the first coup d'etat in the country's history, because these black men were forcibly removed from office by this group named the Red Coats. Now, the red shirts, excuse me. And the red shirts were like the Ku Klux Klan, but they didn't worry about wearing any hoods. You knew exactly who they were, because they didn't mask up. And a lot of the furor behind the propaganda to remove these brothers was portrayed in the media previously, as they continue to write stories about black men raping white women, because there's a lot of white women who ended up with black children in that particular time. And so there was a brother, and I like I said, I wanted to look it up real quick, but I'm looking at something else on my phone. This brother actually went out and actually had his own printing press. And in his printing press, he wrote up the story detailing the fact that it was white women who were chasing black men around. And because of this led to this is exactly the incident that sort of like stoked the fires of the Wilmington race massacre. And we need to really illustrate the power of this, right? Because we're going to get into the whole notion behind, white women and their infusion of violence sexually towards black men, and weaponizing it against themselves, weaponizing their white womanhood as victims against brothers, right? The damsel in distress that they play.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happened was, based on this, they burnt down his printing press. Now he fled to Philadelphia, and because he was, he was mixed, he was, half black, half white. He passed for white in order to elude capture here in Philadelphia. But while that was going on, they used that incident to then raid the state Senate house, the state assembly house in Wilmington. And then they went on to go to the black neighborhoods. And this is something that we need to, because too many of our women have assumed the same, tried to assume these types of controls and manipulation tactics over black men. But so we got to address that later. But because of this particular the furor that was unfurled, they then went into the old military war chest of the Confederacy and broke out Gatling guns. The Gatling guns you wind up, the first machine guns. And those guns lined up beside it on roads and streets with rifles and shotguns. And then they participated in setting the houses on fire where all the black families are in. And when the women and children were running out of the house, they were gunning them down in the streets.
They eviscerated that community. That's right. The word I'm gonna use.
So the numbers between 300 and 800 people, 800 black folk were killed that day in that particular time. So that is one of the byproducts of those things. Everybody knows about Tulsa and well, not everybody, but people should know about what happened in Tulsa with the two lovers that were caught in the elevator, and then the white woman screamed that she was being sexually assaulted by the brother when they were caught kissing and the doors opened up. Right, so that led to that. But I want to get into the definition of grape real quick as I transition, right? Because I think it's very important when you speak about people not being able to, or people not alluding to the fact that men can't be great. Listen to the definition that is currently, if you look this up, if you do a Google search, this is the definition that is still in existence today. Grape is a sexual assault involving sexual penetration without the victim's consent. Now, most people, when you hear that, you realize that unless you're using some type of tool or object, a man cannot be graped by a woman. But so, and as we go on, content, and it says penetration, this includes sexual intercourse or other forms of penetration. So, such as a project or another body part performed against someone's will, someone who is incapable of giving valid consent or without their voluntary, genuine, and willing agreement. Now, I can tell you that when you read that definition, it totally removes any aspect, with the exception of probing or plugging for a man to be graped by a woman. But I can tell you as a man, I have been, if you want to go by the other definition that was used, which is sex without your consent, when we all speak of euphemisms such as no meaning no, several times. And I've been told by women, listen, if I wanted to have sex with you, I'll just take it. And as long as your body part work, they can just take it.
Well,
unless you want to get violent with them,
yeah,
which could possibly lead to some other complications. And this happened to me on more than one occasion. I've been groped in the workplace, and you know, listen, I worked in one place where it was a customary thing. You got too close to women, they would literally grab your crotch and to size you up against everybody else that's in there, or to promote their sexual innuendos with you. So when I read the definition, because I just wanted to check it out to see if it changed or if it was updated, it's still archaic in concerns to the times we live in today and how easily it is for or how narrow the scope and scale is for those who can easily be considered the aggressor in these situations versus somebody who, because they choose not to try to overpower someone else, can be considered the victims. It's just a crazy way of looking at it, but with that playing for now, there's much more to come, sure.
Yeah. That definition that you read, you know, looking at the definition, because it's talking about penetration without one's consent. Well, that doesn't just mean that a person is held down and being penetrated against their will. That also means that a person is penetrating another person, and the penetrator is doing that against their will, because that happens. It happens. That's why we're here talking about the history of it. So, and we're going to come back to it, but you also alluded to the false SA claims that have happened throughout history, because, you know, black men, that has been something that as black men, you learn that it happens to a lot of black men. I mean, we can see it. It's a high profile case right now going on with Shannon Sharp with SA claims, and the way it's looking, it looked kind of shaky, you know.
Just and and we've all talked about situations I've dealt with and dealing with. And it's something to the fact that if you have a conversation, even if the conversation is led by women in the workplace, right? If you respond to something they say in the comment, in the conversation that they get offended by, but we're having a conversation, they then can take those conversations to the DEI office and have you put under investigation for workplace discrimination and sexual discrimination in the workplace, and sexual not sexual assault, but sexual harassment in the workplace.
So
based on those conversations.
Right. So that leads me to this. So Pat, let's go ahead and jump up in here, right? You saw the clip. You're familiar with the history of sexual assault against Black men. You heard what PC just said. So the question I have for you is, Black men have been the face of SA in America for a while, for over 100 years. So how do we educate at least our people on the history of sex SA against Black men? How do we educate them about this group of men who are actually being victimized, even though this group of men are the face of SA?
How do we? You want my real answer or my keep hope alive answer?
Give me the real. The real one gonna be more entertaining anyway. So
the real answer is we can't. You can't. What you're asking for is the equivalent to, in the minds of the people that we're talking about trying to educate, is the equivalent to teaching people that it's okay for a PDF file to babysit kids. Like, it's on that level for these people. And we're seeing that play out in several other conversations that are being had about us as a group, Black men as a group. Yes, there are some allies. We have to say that not everybody is kicking our teeth in. But for the most part, there's a lot of teeth being, slammed in the curves. So what would be nice is if we could just have a conversation about how we used to try to have this conversation a while back when we used to talk about there's nothing that Black men went through that Black women didn't go through, and there's nothing that Black women went through that Black men didn't go through, and blah, and vice versa, and vice. And we used to have that. We used to try to have that conversation. Now we can't have that conversation anymore because we're stuck in a perpetual game of victim Olympics. And right now, the world champ don't want to give up the title. And we're not even asking for the title. But any sort of message that alludes to the fact that we went through things too, they view as an attempt or a claim at the throne. And we get smacked back. So you can't talk to a large swath of people about Black men being victimized in a sexual way. I was having this conversation not too long ago with a white woman who was trying her damnedest to little boy me in the conversation. And she was getting very frustrated because, my favorite game is
ask questions, and you're right.
Yeah, you're right. Now what? It's my favorite game. So as I'm playing the game with her, I decided to pause the game for a moment, and I just asked her, you keep saying that Black men have more rights than white women. What about the Black men that were owned by white women? And she said, well, there were no Black men owned by married white women. And I said, yes, there were. And she said white women didn't have the authority or the legal standing to own anybody if she was married. And I showed her documentation that says you're wrong. If we were alive 200-300 years ago, you could have owned me.
Right.
And your husband could have tried to assume control of me, and you could have taken your husband to court, sued him, and won the case and continued to own me.
Just talked about that in the clip.
She could not process that. Like, and it wasn't just processing it from me, it was processing it from sources of people that had the same melanin deficiencies that she does.
Mm-hmm.
She couldn't stomach it. And then I've had the same conversations with black women who, revealing that to them and showing them the evidence, broke down the conversation. They later came back and said, I just had to process that because I never heard of nothing like that before. But the optics of it, the mere fact that hearing this piece of information broke the conversation for them until they were able to process it and come back, that says a lot about how far away we are from being able to really educate people the way we need to educate them.
I just don't understand, like, white people and I get it because the narrative is spent that only white men, or that's what we see. We only see white male slave owners. I get that, but if you've never come across the information, how do you argue against something that you don't know exists?